"You don't belong at the family table," my sister sneered. Then she yanked my chair away, and I hit the floor in front of 200 guests. Her groom shot to his feet. "That's enough. Do you really want me to tell everyone the truth?" My sister rose. I want to say I saw it coming, that there was some slow accumulation of warning signs I chose to ignore because it was easier than confronting my sister before she stood at an altar in front of 200 people who loved her. But the truth is, I didn't see any of it coming until a folder slid out from under a car seat and landed open on wet asphalt. And even then, it took me 3 weeks to understand what I was actually looking at. My name is Renata. My sister is Della. Our father is Walton, and until 14 months ago, he ran the hardware store our grandfather opened in 1974, the kind of place where he knew every regular customer's name and what they were building before they finished describing it. He had a stroke on a Tuesday morning while restocking a shelf of paint thinner, and by the time the ambulance got him to the hospital, the left side of his body had stopped answering him. His speech went with it, not his mind. Everyone who worked with him in those first months made that mistake exactly once, watching him struggle to form words and assuming the struggle meant confusion, and every single time he corrected them with a look so sharp it could cut glass. He communicates now through a combination of gestures our family learned by trial and error, and a tablet his speech therapist configured with a bank of common phrases, needs, and names. 3 taps on any hard surface means no, emphatic, and unmistakable. A single tap means maybe, or wait, or let me think. He can point, he can nod. On a good day, with enough time, he can type out a full sentence letter by letter using the tablet's keyboard, though it costs him enough effort that he saves it for things that actually matter. What he cannot do, not even on his best day, is hold a pen steady enough to produce a signature that looks like anything other than what it is. The signature of a man relearning how to control his own hand. Della is 2 years younger than me and has always been better at rooms than I am. She reads a party the way I read a spreadsheet, instantly, completely, without visible effort. Growing up, this meant she got invited to things I didn't, and I told myself for a long time that I didn't mind because I had other things: good grades, a scholarship, eventually a job managing operations at a regional hospital system that paid well enough to let me help with Dad's care without resenting every dollar of it. Della went a different direction. Sales, then marketing, then a string of jobs with impressive titles and inconsistent paychecks, always managing to look like more money was coming in than actually was. 3 months before her wedding to a man named Julian, I still believed my sister and I had a relationship built on real affection, complicated by real differences, but fundamentally intact. I want that on record, because everything that follows makes more sense if you understand that I wasn't looking for a reason to think badly of her. I was actively avoiding one. The folder slid out on a Thursday evening in early April. I'd driven over to help Della load wedding favor boxes into her car after a family dinner at our father's house, the kind of ordinary task that fills the weeks before a wedding, and I was reaching under the passenger seat for a box that had slid too far back when my hand hit the folder instead. It came out with the box, and the folder's contents spilled across the wet driveway before I could stop them. I picked the pages up quickly, more out of instinct than curiosity, the same way you'd catch a glass before it hits the floor. It was only once I had them gathered into a stack, straightening the corners out of habit, that I actually looked at what I was holding. County seal in the top corner. A property address I would have recognized blindfolded, because it was the address I grew up at. The house my father bought the year I was born and had lived in every year since. A deed transfer form, the kind that moves ownership from one party to another, filled out in a font too clean to be handwritten and printed rather than typed. And at the bottom, on the line marked grantor signature, was my father's name signed in handwriting that was not his handwriting. Below it, on a second line marked witness, was my own name. My own signature, or something built to pass as my own signature at a glance. I had never seen this document before in my life. I stood in the driveway holding it for what felt like a very long time. Long enough that Della came back out of the house asking what was taking me so long, and I made a decision in that moment that I've turned over in my head many times since, wondering if it was the right one. I didn't ask her about it. I said I'd dropped the box and needed a second to restack it, and I handed her the wedding favors, and I drove home with my own phone's camera roll suddenly containing 9 photographs I hadn't planned on taking that evening. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the photos blown up on my laptop screen, comparing the signature on the witness line against my own actual signature on every document I could find in my apartment. A lease, a tax form, an old library card application I'd kept for no reason I could explain. The forger had gotten the general shape right, the loop on the R, the way I crossed my T with a slight upward flick. But the pressure was wrong, too even. The kind of consistency that comes from someone practicing a signature, slowly rather than writing their own name the way you write it 1,000 times without thinking, fast and slightly different every time. Whoever signed my name to that document had studied my handwriting. That was not a detail I could explain away as coincidence or clerical error. Someone had sat down with an example of my signature and practiced copying it until it was good enough to pass a glance, and then they had used it to attach my name, as a witness, to a transfer of my father's house. I didn't sleep much that night. By morning, I had a plan that felt less like a plan and more like the only direction I could think to move in, find out who had actually notarized this thing, because notaries keep logs, and logs don't lie the way people do. The notary stamp on the document was registered to a man named Marcus Delgado, and it took me a full minute of staring at the name to place why it sounded familiar. Marcus was Julian's best man. He was also, I remembered from an offhand comment at an engagement dinner months earlier, a licensed notary who did the occasional side work for extra income, mostly real estate closings for friends of friends. He was also going to be officiating Della and Julian's friend's wedding, because it turned out he was ordained through some online ministry as well as licensed as a notary, a combination he'd apparently found funny enough to bring up more than once. I called him on a Friday afternoon and asked if I could come by to talk about a notarization question, keeping my voice deliberately vague. He said sure, come by his apartment that evening. He had his log there. Marcus's kitchen table was covered in wedding-related paperwork of his own, a printed ceremony script, sticky notes with reminders about ring placement, and he cleared a space for me without seeming to think much of the visit until I set the deed transfer down in front of him. I need to know if you notarized this, I said. He picked it up, scanned it, and his expression shifted somewhere between recognition and confusion. Yeah, I think so. Let me check. He pulled a black logbook from a drawer, the kind of physical record every notary is required to keep, and flipped through pages until he found an entry dated in early March. He turned the book around so I could see it myself. The entry recorded a notarization for a property transfer document, the address matching, the date matching a Tuesday afternoon roughly 3 weeks before I found the folder. Under the signer's name, my father's name was listed. Under the witness name, mine. Was I there? I asked. Do you remember me being there? Marcus looked at the entry for a long moment, then looked at me, and something in his face told me he already understood this wasn't a casual question. Honestly, no. I don't remember you being in the room. I remember Della bringing her father in. I want to say he was in a wheelchair, which tracked with what I knew about his stroke, so I didn't think anything of it. I remember him nodding when I asked if he understood what he was signing. I don't remember a witness being present. I should have caught that. There's supposed to be a witness signature obtained in front of me, not pre-filled. He flipped to the blank line meant for witness verification, a separate line from the signature itself, a line meant to be initialed by the notary confirming the witness had signed in their physical presence. It was empty. I didn't verify a witness, he said quietly. I notarized a signing where the paperwork already had a witness name filled in, and I didn't catch that I never actually watched that person sign, because I was focused on making sure your dad understood what he was doing. That's on me. But it also means whoever filled in your name did it before this ever got to me. I asked him if he remembered anything else about that day, anything about how Della had presented the situation, and he thought about it before answering. She said you'd already signed as witness earlier that day and had to leave for work. I didn't question it. I probably should have. I left his apartment with a photograph of the logbook entry and the beginning of a plan that no longer felt uncertain. Someone had forged my signature, presented my father for a real notarization while omitting the fact that no witness had actually been present, and used the resulting document to attempt a transfer of his house. The only person with access to my handwriting, motive, and the document itself was standing at the center of every version of this story I could construct, and it was my sister. Priya Anand had been our father's care coordinator since his discharge from inpatient rehab, the person responsible for making sure his medical needs, his home modifications, and increasingly his financial protections stayed aligned with what his stroke had actually left him capable of managing. I'd worked with her closely enough over the past year that I trusted her completely, which is why she was the first person I brought the full picture to rather than going straight to my father himself. I laid it out for her in her small office on a Monday morning, the folder, the forged signature, Marcus's logbook, the missing witness verification. She listened without interrupting, which I'd learned was one of her habits when something serious was being described to her. And when I finished, she pulled a blank intake form toward her and started writing before she said anything at all. I'm going to be honest with you, she said. This is exactly the pattern we train coordinators to watch for, with stroke patients who have significant assets and family members who might be under financial pressure. It doesn't mean your sister did this with bad intentions in some cartoonish sense. People convince themselves of a lot of things when they're desperate, but intentions don't change what the document does if it goes through. She picked up her office phone and called the county recorder's office directly, walking through a process I hadn't known existed: an emergency hold request on a property record, available when there's a credible allegation of fraud or incapacity affecting the validity of a transfer. She read off the document's recording number from the photo I'd sent her, explained the situation in clipped professional language that stripped all the emotion out of it, and hung up 20 minutes later with confirmation that a hold had been placed pending review. That buys us time, she said. It doesn't undo anything that's already happened, and it doesn't tell us what she was planning to do with the house once the transfer went through, but it stops it from moving further while we figure out what we're actually looking at. I asked her what she thought Della's plan might have been, and Priya was careful in her answer, the way people are careful when they're speculating about someone they've never met. Could be as simple as needing collateral for something, could be more complicated. I've seen cases where an adult child transfers a parent's property into their own name specifically so it can be used to secure a loan, sometimes for something as significant as a wedding venue deposit, without the parent ever being told that's what the paperwork actually does. Your father may have genuinely believed he was signing something related to his ongoing care. People with speech difficulties are especially vulnerable to that kind of framing because it's harder for them to ask follow-up questions in the moment. That detail sat with me for days afterward. My father had likely been told, in a room with Marcus present, that he was signing something for his own benefit, something related to his health or his home, and he had nodded and consented to a process he had no real way to verify because the person explaining it to him was his own daughter. Priya's hold protected the house. It did nothing to explain what my sister had actually been planning to do once she had it, and it did nothing to prepare me for the version of the story I'd eventually learn was true. I told myself I wasn't going to say anything at the wedding. I had a hold on the property, I had Marcus's statement, I had photographs, and Priya had already started the process of formally reporting the forgery to the county's fraud unit. The legal machinery was moving. There was no no reason to blow up my sister's wedding day when the actual protective work had already been done quietly, in offices, by people whose job it was to handle exactly this kind of thing. I went to the wedding anyway, because not going would have raised questions I wasn't ready to answer, and because my father wanted me there. He'd typed it out on his tablet the week before. Slow and deliberate. Want you at wedding. Sit with me. Della had other plans for where I'd sit. When I arrived at the reception hall, the seating chart posted near the entrance placed me at a table near the kitchen doors, tucked behind a support pillar, 3 tables away from the head table where my father sat in his wheelchair in a rented tuxedo jacket, tablet resting on the linen in front of him. I didn't argue with the seating chart. I found my assigned seat and told myself the wedding would be over in a few hours, and none of this would matter once the paperwork worked its way through the system Priya had started. I was still adjusting my chair when Della found me. She'd clearly had a drink or two, enough to loosen whatever restraint might have otherwise kept her from confronting me in the middle of her own reception, and she stood over my table with a look I recognized from childhood, the specific expression she wore right before deciding to make something someone else's problem. You don't belong at the family table, my sister sneered. Then she yanked my chair away, and I hit the floor in front of 200 guests. Her groom shot to his feet. That's enough. Do you really want me to tell everyone the truth? My sister froze. For a moment, nobody moved, glass from a knocked-over water goblet already biting into my palm, and I looked past her toward our father instead of getting up. Della's face shifted from triumph to confusion as Julian's words registered, and the room had gone the particular kind of silent that happens when 200 people simultaneously decide something real is happening, and their phones come out almost as one motion. Julian, what are you talking about? Della said, and her voice had lost the sharp edge it carried a moment earlier. Julian didn't answer her directly. He looked past her, toward the head table, toward my father, and then toward the side of the room where Marcus stood in his officiant's collar, having watched the entire exchange unfold from a few feet away. Marcus, Julian said. Show her. Marcus stepped forward, pulling a folded photocopy from inside his jacket, the same page I'd shown him weeks earlier. He set it on the head table directly in front of my father and smoothed it flat. I notarized this in March, Marcus said, loud enough to carry across the now silent room. I'm supposed to watch a witness sign in my presence before I stamp anything. I didn't. Renata's name was already on this line when the document reached me, and Renata was never in the room. He turned to my father. Walton, did you understand that this document transferred the house out of your name? My father looked at the page, looked at Della, and shook his head once, slow, side to side, the gesture he uses when there is no ambiguity left in his answer at all. He's saying no, Marcus said. I logged it wrong. I trusted a signature that was already on the page instead of watching it happen. That's my mistake, and I'll own it. But the document itself is fraudulent, and everyone in this room should know that before this reception goes any further. Della's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Julian looked at his bride with an expression that had already moved past anger into something closer to grief, and he told the room quietly but audibly that the reception was over, and he walked toward the exit without waiting to see if she'd follow. For a few minutes, standing there with glass still embedded in my palm and 200 phones still recording, I believed that was the end of it. My father's house was protected. My sister's forgery was exposed in front of every witness who mattered. Whatever came next, the county fraud review, the inevitable conversation between Della and our parents, the wreckage of a wedding that had ended before the vows were even exchanged, felt like it belonged to a story that had already reached its conclusion. I genuinely believed for those few minutes that I understood everything that had happened. I was wrong about that, and it would take me another 6 weeks to find out how wrong. The weeks after the wedding moved the way weeks move after any disaster that happens in public. Slowly at first, everyone processing in private, and then all at once, as details filtered out through relatives who couldn't help themselves. Julian filed for an annulment within the month, citing fraud discovered on the wedding day itself as grounds, and from what I understood through my aunt, who stayed in contact with him longer than anyone expected, he didn't fight for a version of the relationship that included trusting Della again. He'd apparently known something was off about the wedding budget for weeks, vendor invoices that didn't match what Della told him they'd agreed to pay, a venue deposit that cleared from an account he didn't recognize, and had been quietly gathering his own concerns before mine ever surfaced in public. My confrontation with Marcus hadn't started his doubt, it had confirmed it. The county fraud unit opened a formal file based on Priya's report and Marcus's corrected log entry. A detective named Osei called me twice to walk through the timeline, asking careful, specific questions about dates and access, the kind of questions that made it clear an actual investigation was underway, rather than a box being checked. He told me, in the second call, that forged deed cases were more common than people assumed and less commonly prosecuted than they should be, because families frequently declined to press charges once the immediate danger was resolved, preferring to handle things privately. I told him I wasn't interested in handling this privately. My father's house had nearly changed hands without his understanding, using my forged name as cover, and I wanted the record to reflect what had actually happened. My mother, for her part, took the position that I had humiliated Della unnecessarily, that the confrontation could have happened privately, away from 200 guests and however many phone cameras, and that I'd chosen public spectacle over family loyalty. I pointed out that I hadn't confronted anyone. Julian had, and Marcus had, and my father had answered a direct question with a headshake that couldn't be misread. I hadn't said a single word until the exchange was already underway. My mother didn't have a response to that beyond repeating that I could have handled things differently, a sentence that told me less about what I'd done and more about what she needed to believe in order to keep speaking to her other daughter. Della, notably, didn't speak to me at all. Not a call, not a text, not an appearance at any family gathering for the rest of that spring. I heard through relatives that she'd moved out of the apartment statement she'd shared with Julian, and back in with our mother, and that she'd hired a lawyer, though whether that lawyer was defending her against the fraud investigation or handling the annulment or both, nobody seemed to know for certain. I visited my father twice a week through all of it, the same rhythm we'd settled into since his stroke, and those visits were the only part of the spring that felt unchanged. He'd type things on his tablet sometimes, slow observations about the investigation, about Della, about how strange it was to have a house that had nearly stopped being his without his understanding how. Once, he typed, "Didn't know, thought I was signing for care, thought it was for me." I told him it wasn't his fault, that Della and whoever helped her had built the whole moment specifically so he wouldn't be able to catch what was actually happening, and he tapped the table once, his gesture for maybe, which I understood to mean he wasn't ready to fully believe that yet. By early June, 6 weeks after the wedding, I'd started to feel something close to settled. The house was safe. The fraud unit had an open file. Della was, by every account I was getting secondhand, isolated from the family and dealing with legal consequences that felt proportionate to what she'd done. I'd stopped checking my phone every morning expecting some new development, because the story, as far as I understood it, had already played out its major beats. Then Detective O.C. called a third time, and this call was different from the first two. His voice had a carefulness to it that I hadn't heard before, the tone of someone about to share something they'd debated how to phrase. "I want to walk you through something we found while pulling records for the county file," he said. "It's going to complicate the picture a little." Detective O.C. asked if we could meet in person rather than continuing over the phone, and I drove to a small municipal building downtown that afternoon, the kind of place with fluorescent lighting and a waiting room chair that had clearly been selected for durability rather than comfort. He met me in a small conference room with a folder considerably thicker than the one I'd originally brought to Priya, and he laid it open on the table between us before saying anything at all. "When we pull a fraud case like this, standard procedure is to check whether the notary involved has other filings that might show a pattern," he said. "Marcus Delgado's log has been clean going back 6 years. No other irregularities, which actually supports his account of what happened with your family's document. He made one mistake, and it was the mistake he described to you. But pattern checking a notary's log naturally means cross-referencing every document tied to a given property address, going back as far as the county's digital records extend, which for this particular parcel goes back about 11 years. He turned the folder toward me. Inside were photocopies of documents I'd never seen before, related to the same property, the house I grew up in, dated nearly 9 years earlier, a refinancing application, a home equity line of credit, and buried in the middle of the stack, a quitclaim deed dated 8 years and 7 months prior, transferring a partial ownership interest in the property from my father to my mother, changing the house from solely his to jointly held. "This one's not forged," Osei said. "Both signatures check out, notarized properly, everything by the book. I'm not showing you this because it's fraudulent. I'm showing you because of what it enabled." He walked me through it slowly. Once the house was jointly held, my mother had used her half of the equity to secure the home equity line of credit, drawn against multiple times over the following years, for purposes the paperwork didn't specify but bank records eventually would, and buried in a stack of more recent bank subpoena responses OC had only requested because the older quitclaim deed had raised a flag worth chasing, was a pattern of transfers from that home equity line into an account held solely in my mother's name, continuing steadily for years, including several large draws in the 6 months immediately preceding Della's wedding. "I want to be careful here," Osei said. "I'm not accusing your mother of forging anything. The equity transfer 8 years ago was legal and consensual, at least on paper. What I'm telling you is that your mother has had ongoing, extensive access to that property's value for close to a decade, well beyond anything your sister could have arranged on her own with a forged signature 3 weeks before a wedding. And the timing of the draws in the months before the wedding lines up closely enough with vendor payments on the wedding itself that I don't think it's coincidental." I sat with that for longer than I probably should have before responding, turning the quitclaim deed's photocopy over in my hands as though a different angle might reveal something the words themselves weren't saying. "You're telling me my mother has been quietly pulling money out of my father's house for 8 years, I said, "and that Della's forgery wasn't some plan she came up with alone. It was built on top of something that was already there. I'm telling you the forged document from March makes a lot more sense once you understand there was already a financial structure in place that made your father's house function like a resource the rest of the family could draw from, with or without a proper conversation about what he understood or agreed to," Osei said. "Whether your sister acted with your mother's knowledge, or copied a pattern she'd simply grown up watching, or something in between, that's the part I can't tell you yet. But I didn't think you should hear about a 9-year paper trail secondhand." I left that building with a folder of photocopies that reframed every assumption I'd built over the previous 6 weeks, and with a question I hadn't thought to ask until that exact moment, sitting in my car in a parking lot, unable to make myself start the engine. If my mother had been quietly accessing my father's equity for 8 years, using a legal structure Della's forgery had merely echoed rather than invented, then what had actually happened at that reception wasn't the end of the story. It was one branch of a much older one, and I'd spent 6 weeks believing I'd already seen the whole tree. I spent the following 2 weeks doing something I hadn't expected to be doing when this started, building a financial timeline of my own mother's decade, using nothing but public records, bank statement excerpts Osei was legally able to share once the investigation formally expanded, and my own memory of family events cross-referenced against draw dates that increasingly refused to look like coincidence. The home equity line of credit had an original limit of $85,000, opened the same year the quitclaim deed transferred partial ownership to my mother. Over the following 8 years, it had been drawn against and partially repaid in a cycle that, mapped against a calendar, tracked almost exactly against family events with associated costs. A kitchen renovation my mother had always described as something she'd saved for separately. A used car for Della during her second year of college, one my mother had told me at the time was a graduation gift from a favorite aunt who, it turned out, had passed away 3 years before that car was purchased. A series of draws in the 18 months before Della's wedding that totaled just under $31,000, roughly matching, dollar for dollar, the deposits and vendor payments associated with the venue Della and Julian had booked. None of this had gone through my father, not because he'd been asked and declined, but because the equity line was structured entirely around my mother's portion of joint ownership, which meant she could draw against it using only her own signature and never needed his consent for any individual transaction, only for the original quitclaim transfer that had made joint ownership possible in the first place, back when his speech and his signature were both still entirely his own. I confronted my mother about this on a Tuesday evening, at her kitchen table, the same table where I'd sat through countless family dinners growing up. I brought copies of everything: the original quitclaim deed, the draw history, the dates lined up against events I remembered clearly enough to know the stories she'd told me about their funding weren't true. She didn't deny any of it, not exactly. What she did instead was something closer to reframing, explaining that the equity was functionally hers to use because she'd been the one managing the household's finances for 30 years, because my father's business income had always run through accounts she administered day to day, because in her mind, the distinction between his money and her money had stopped meaning much of anything decades before his stroke made the question legally relevant in a way it never had been before. I never took anything that wasn't going to benefit this family, she said. Every dollar of that went toward you kids, toward this house, toward things your father would have wanted paid for if he'd been the one handling the details instead of me. I asked her directly whether Della's forged document in March had been her idea, whether Della had learned the mechanism of using the house's value from watching her mother do it for years, or whether the two of them had planned the March transfer together, deliberately, as a faster and larger version of what my mother had already been doing gradually. My mother's answer to that question, and the way she avoided answering it directly for nearly 20 minutes before finally admitting what she knew, became the piece of the story that mattered most, and it's the piece I'm still not fully at peace with, even now. She told me Della had come to her in February, frustrated that the wedding budget had grown far beyond what either of them had planned for, and that she, my mother, had suggested Della handle it the way I always have, a phrase she used more than once during that conversation, as though it explained and excused everything simultaneously. She told me she hadn't known Della planned to forge my signature specifically. She'd assumed, she said, that Della would find some version of consent from our father the way she herself always had, a nod, a general gesture, something that could be technically defended even if it wouldn't hold up to genuine scrutiny. I didn't tell her to forge anything, my mother said. I told her there was a way to do this quickly if the wedding needed it. I didn't ask how she was planning to make it happen. I should have asked. I didn't want to know badly enough to ask. I left her house that night with a version of the story that was significantly worse than the one I'd believed for 6 weeks. Not because my sister's individual act had changed, but because I now understood it as something she'd learned rather than invented, taught by a decade of watching our mother treat our father's ownership of his own house as a formality that could be quietly worked around whenever it became inconvenient. I didn't know yet what I was going to do with that understanding. I only knew that the reception hall version of the truth, the one Marcus had spoken out loud in front of 200 guests, had been real and accurate and also, somehow, incomplete, in a way that made the whole story land differently once I finally had the rest of it. The county fraud investigation, once it expanded to include the 8-year pattern of equity draws, moved into territory that required more than Detective Osei's involvement. A civil matter involving joint ownership, undisclosed financial management, and a vulnerable adult's assets eventually needed an elder law attorney, and Priya was the one who connected me with a woman named Ilsa Brandt, who specialized in exactly this kind of tangled family financial situation. Ilsa's first move was to request an independent competency and understanding evaluation for my father, not because anyone doubted his cognitive ability, but because establishing clearly, on formal record, exactly what he had and hadn't understood about the equity line, the quitclaim deed, and the March forgery would matter enormously for whatever came next, whether that meant criminal charges against Della, a civil claim against my mother, or some combination neither of us had fully worked out yet. The evaluation happened on a Thursday morning in early July, 4 months after the original forged document, in a conference room at the hospital system where I worked, chosen because my father was comfortable there, and because a doctor on staff was qualified to conduct exactly this kind of assessment alongside Ilsa, and a court-appointed notary whose only job was to observe and certify the process. I sat in on it at my father's request, typed out on his tablet the night before. Want you there? Want this on record right. The doctor walked him through a series of questions designed to establish baseline understanding. Did he know what year it was? Who was president? Basic orientation questions that felt almost insulting given how clearly his mind worked, but that Ilsa had explained were necessary to establish a documented baseline before moving into the substantive questions that actually mattered. Then the doctor asked him directly whether he had understood, at the time he signed the quitclaim deed 9 years earlier, that it made my mother a joint owner of the house with independent authority to borrow against its value. My father used his tablet for this answer rather than a gesture, spelling it out letter by letter with the same slow, deliberate elaborate care he brought to anything he considered important enough to say in full sentences rather than shorthand. It took him almost 4 minutes to finish, and nobody in the room interrupted or rushed him. Thought it was for taxes. She said joint ownership would help with taxes. Did not know she could borrow against it alone. Did not know about home equity line. Would not have agreed if I understood that. The doctor asked him next about March, about the day Marcus notarized the deed transfer, about whether he'd understood that document was transferring ownership out of his name entirely. Thought I was signing something for my care, for physical therapy costs, Stella said. Did not read every word. Trusted her. Did not know Renata's name was on it as witness. Did not see Renata that day. The doctor asked one final question, the one Ilsa had told me beforehand would matter most for the record, whether, understanding everything he now understood about both documents, he wanted his ownership of the house restored fully and independently, undoing the joint ownership structure from 9 years earlier, as well as unwinding the March forgery. My father didn't need his tablet for that answer. He looked at the doctor and at Ilsa, and then at me, and nodded once, firm and unmistakable, the same gesture he'd used to answer any question he considered entirely settled in his own mind. Ilsa filed the paperwork within the week, a formal petition to restore sole ownership of the property to my father, supported by the documented competency evaluation, the forgery finding from Marcus's corrected notary log, and the pattern evidence Osei had compiled on the equity draws. The county granted the restoration in early August, a formality on paper that took less than a page to accomplish, undoing in a single filing what had taken 9 years and 2 separate acts of deception to construct. My mother did not contest the filing. I don't know whether that was a strategic decision made with legal advice or simply an acknowledgement, finally, of what the documented record made undeniable once it existed, in a form a court could examine plainly, that whatever she'd told herself about family money and shared responsibility over 3 decades of marriage, the house had never stopped being legally and specifically my father's, and both the joint ownership structure and the forged transfer that followed it had been built on his understanding of documents he was never given a full or honest account of. Della was charged with forgery and attempted fraud related specifically to the March document. My mother was not criminally charged. The original quitclaim deed 9 years earlier had been legally executed, however incomplete my father's understanding of its consequences may have been, and proving fraudulent intent for a transaction that old, built on a conversation with no witnesses beyond the 2 people who'd had it, was not something the county attorney believed they could establish beyond reasonable doubt. Ilsa told me this was a common and frustrating limitation in cases like ours. The newer, sloppier forgery was easier to prove than the older, more careful arrangement that had made it possible in the first place. I understood finally, sitting in Ilsa's office reviewing the restored deed with my father's name alone on the ownership line, that the reception hall confrontation 4 months earlier had been true in every detail and still hadn't been the actual reveal. It had been the visible edge of something my mother had spent nearly a decade building quietly enough that even I, someone who visited twice a week, who managed his care alongside her, hadn't noticed the shape of it until a detective pulled records that went back further than anyone had thought to ask. The restored deed sits in a folder in my father's apartment now, in a drawer he can reach from his wheelchair without help, and every so often, without any particular occasion prompting it, he asks me to bring it out so he can look at it again. He can't hold a pen steady enough to sign anything that matters, and everyone who has ever needed his signature for something real has learned to build the process around that fact honestly, with a witness who is actually a witness and a notary who watches the signing happen rather than trusting a name that arrived on the page ahead of time. I visited him this past Tuesday, our regular day, and found him already sitting near the window with his tablet in his lap, the deed folder open on the table beside him even though I hadn't asked to see it. He'd apparently been looking at it before I arrived. He typed something out for me before I'd even finished taking off my coat, slow and deliberate the way he types anything he's been sitting with for a while before deciding to say it. 9 years. Didn't know. Should have asked more questions. I told him he'd ask the only question that mattered the moment he actually understood what he was being asked, and that the not knowing before that point wasn't a failure of his. It was the entire design of what had been done to him. He looked at me for a long moment, tapped the table once, his gesture for maybe, and then went back to looking at the deed with his own name, and only his own name, sitting alone on the ownership line where it had always belonged.